Murder in the Woods. The rain poured down in an unrelenting torrent, soaking Emma to the bone as she stumbled forward through the dense, dark woods. Each step was an ordeal, her boots squelched in the muddy ground, splashing through puddles of cold, murky water. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon, partially hidden by thick clouds that rolled angrily across the sky. Thunder rumbled overhead, a low, ominous growl that seemed to follow her every move. The trees swayed and creaked in the fierce wind, their skeletal branches clawing at the air as if they were alive. Emma pulled her jacket tighter around her, though it did little to keep the chill from seeping into her bones. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and the sheer enormity of the forest seemed to close in around her. She stopped for a moment, her chest heaving as she tried to collect her thoughts. The campsite felt like a distant memory now, a warm and inviting haven that seemed impossible to find in the vast expanse of shadowy wilderness. She reached into her pocket, fumbling for her phone, but when she pulled it out, her heart sank. The screen was black, dead from the storm or drained of battery. Emma cursed under her breath, clenching the useless device in her trembling hand before shoving it back into her pocket. There would be no calling for help, no GPS to guide her back. The wind howled louder, carrying with it the eerie creaks of trees swaying in protest against the storm. Every sound felt amplified in the oppressive silence of the woods, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the steady patter of rain on the forest floor. Emma's pulse quickened as she forced her feet to move again, one in front of the other, trying to quell the rising panic in her chest. Lightning suddenly split the sky, its harsh white light illuminating the forest for the briefest of moments. In that fleeting second, Emma thought she saw something moving through the trees. A shape, dark and indistinct, flitted across her line of sight, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribcage. The storm seemed to grow quieter for a moment, as if holding its breath. Emma strained her ears, trying to hear past the pounding rain. Was it just her imagination? The shadow had been so quick, so faint. It could have been an animal, she told herself, or even the play of light and shadow from the lightning. Yet, she couldn't shake the unease that gripped her. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides as she tried to muster the courage to move forward. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the wind. But the words felt hollow, and the tiny voice in the back of her mind refused to be silenced. Something was out there. Emma's gaze darted from tree to tree, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The woods seemed unnaturally quiet now, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Her breathing quickened, and she felt the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She took a cautious step forward, then another, her boots crunching against the damp leaves beneath her. Suddenly, a crack echoed through the air, a branch snapping somewhere behind her. Emma spun around, her eyes wide with fear, but the shadows offered no answers. The trees loomed tall and foreboding, their dark silhouettes swaying gently in the wind. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The sound was swallowed by the storm, leaving her feeling even more isolated than before. She shook her head, berating herself for letting her imagination run wild. There was nothing out here, she insisted, no one lurking in the shadows. It was just the storm playing tricks on her mind. But even as she tried to convince herself, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The sensation was suffocating, a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She glanced over her shoulder again, half expecting to see something, or someone, staring back at her. The forest remained silent, save for the relentless patter of rain. Clenching her jaw, Emma forced herself to keep moving. Her pace quickened, her feet splashing through the muddy ground with renewed urgency. She had to get back to the campsite. She had to find shelter, warmth, safety, anything to escape the oppressive fear that clung to her like a second skin. The storm raged on, the wind howling through the trees and whipping her wet hair against her face. Emma felt her strength waning, her legs growing heavier with each step. Yet, she pressed on, determined to escape the darkness that seemed to close in around her. Just as she thought she might collapse from exhaustion, another flash of lightning lit up the forest. Once again, she caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow darting between the trees, faster than she could process. Her breath hitched, and a cold chill ran down her spine. Emma's mind raced with questions. Was someone following her? Was it an animal, a stranger, or something worse? She didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at her resolve. For a fleeting moment, she considered turning back, retracing her steps to the spot where she'd first realized she was lost. But the thought was quickly dismissed. There was nothing to go back to, and every step forward, no matter how terrifying, brought her closer to safety, or so she hoped. With renewed determination, Emma wiped the rain from her eyes and focused on the path ahead. The woods were a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, but she refused to let fear consume her. One foot after another, she pushed forward, her heart pounding and her mind racing. Somewhere in the darkness, hope awaited, or so she told herself, clinging to the belief like a lifeline. The relentless rain continued to fall, soaking Emma's hair and clothes, its cold touch biting into her skin. Her breathing was uneven, her body trembling from the cold and the exhaustion of her desperate trek. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of her fear and the vast, uncaring woods were conspiring to pull her down. She stopped briefly, leaning against a tree, her hand gripping the rough bark as she tried to steady herself. For a moment, she closed her eyes, allowing herself to drift into her thoughts, searching for a scrap of solace amidst the chaos. As if summoned by her desperation, a memory surfaced, a vivid, warm flash of her father, Lucas. He had always been her anchor, the steady hand guiding her through the storms of life. Emma could see him so clearly in her mind now, sitting on the porch of their old house, rain pouring all around them. The two of them would sit side by side, their legs dangling over the edge of the wooden steps, drenched but unbothered by the cold wetness of the rain. Lucas had always had a knack for turning even the most mundane moments into something magical. He would hold her hand tightly, a comforting grip that seemed to promise her that everything would be okay, no matter how stormy life became. "Patience, Em," he would say with that familiar, reassuring smile. "Rain can be loud and messy, but it's the only way we get rainbows. Just wait. The storm always ends." His words were etched into her soul, a mantra that she hadn't realized she'd been repeating to herself tonight. Emma could remember the way Lucas would tilt his head back, letting the rain cascade over his face as if it were a gentle blessing rather than an inconvenience. She would laugh at him, calling him silly, but deep down, she loved those moments. There was something about his unshakable optimism, his ability to find beauty in the chaos, that made her feel safe and grounded. Even now, standing alone in the drenched forest, with the storm roaring around her, Emma could almost feel his hand in hers. The memory brought a strange warmth to her chest, a fleeting moment of comfort that pushed back the gnawing dread threatening to overwhelm her. She could hear his voice, calm and steady, whispering in her mind, reminding her that she was stronger than she thought. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at the sky, the rain falling in heavy sheets. It seemed endless, but Lucas's words echoed in her heart. The storm always ends. She clung to that thought, using it as a lifeline to pull herself out of her spiraling fear. Her father wouldn't have wanted her to give up, not now, not ever. He had always believed in her, and that belief had carried her through so much already. It had to carry her through this too. The forest suddenly felt a little less suffocating. The wind still howled, and the rain still poured, but Emma's grip on the bark of the tree tightened, not out of desperation, but out of resolve. She would survive this night. She would make it back to the campsite, back to safety. She would honor her father's memory by holding on, by pushing through the fear and exhaustion that threatened to drag her down. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the cold, damp air. Her father had once told her that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing what needed to be done despite the fear. Emma felt that now, a quiet courage growing within her as she drew strength from the memory of Lucas's unwavering faith in her. She straightened, her legs still trembling but steadier than before. Emma thought back to the rainbows they used to watch together, how they would sit in awe as the storm gave way to sunlight, painting the sky in brilliant arcs of color. Those rainbows had always felt like promises, like proof that beauty could emerge from even the darkest of moments. She could almost hear Lucas laughing, teasing her about her impatience as she squinted at the sky, eager for the first hint of color. The memory made her smile, a small, fleeting curve of her lips, but it was enough to remind her of why she had to keep going. She wasn't ready to give up, not when she still carried the lessons and love her father had given her. The storm might rage around her, but Emma knew that she had faced storms before and survived. Taking one last glance at the darkened sky, she whispered softly, "Thank you, Dad." It wasn't much, but it felt like he could hear her somehow, like he was watching over her, urging her forward. With a renewed sense of determination, Emma pushed herself away from the tree, her steps more purposeful than before. The forest was still vast and dark, and she had no guarantee of finding her way back anytime soon, but she carried her father's words with her, a steadying presence in the chaos. The rain may have been unyielding, but so was she. And somewhere beyond the storm, Emma knew, a rainbow was waiting. The rain poured relentlessly, soaking Emma's hair and drenching her clothes as the storm enveloped her in its cold, chaotic embrace. The woods around her were dark and unyielding, and the path she had been trying to follow was long gone, erased by her own frantic steps and the unceasing downpour. Every sound in the forest, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves, set her nerves on edge, making her feel as though she wasn't alone. She fought against the rising tide of fear, but it clung to her like the wetness of her clothes, suffocating and impossible to ignore. Her legs ached, her breaths were short and sharp, and the urge to simply collapse onto the forest floor, to give in to the storm, grew stronger with each passing moment. But even as the fear threatened to overwhelm her, a memory surfaced, clear and vivid, as if the storm itself had drawn it out of her. It was a memory of her father, Lucas, and the countless rainy days they had shared together. Lucas had always loved the rain. While most people hurried to find shelter, avoiding every drop, he embraced it. Emma could still see him in her mind's eye, sitting on the porch steps of their old house, with the rain pouring down around him. He would wear that same, slightly worn jacket and hold an old umbrella that was more for show than use. She would sit beside him, her smaller frame tucked into his side, feeling the steady warmth of his presence despite the chill in the air. "Patience, Em," he would say, his voice calm and soothing, a perfect counterbalance to the drumming of the rain. The storm's just part of the process. Rainbows only come after the rain. Emma used to roll her eyes at him, especially when she was younger. "Rainbows are boring," she would argue, crossing her arms and pretending to be unimpressed. But Lucas would just chuckle, ruffling her hair and pointing to the sky. "You say that now," he'd reply, "but when you see one, you'll realize the wait was worth it." Now, standing in the middle of this endless forest, with rain pouring down on her and fear clawing at her heart, Emma clung to that memory like a lifeline. She could almost feel her father's presence, as though he were standing beside her, holding her hand like he used to. The thought of him brought an unexpected warmth to her chest, a small, fleeting comfort that pushed back the darkness threatening to consume her. She remembered the way they would sit for what felt like hours, watching the rain as it blurred the edges of the world. Lucas would hum softly, some old tune she could never quite place, and it always made her feel safe. Sometimes, if they were lucky, the rain would stop just as the sun broke through the clouds, and a rainbow would arch across the sky in brilliant colors. Lucas would point it out with a triumphant grin, as if he had conjured it himself. "See? Told you it was worth it," he'd say, and Emma would laugh despite herself, unable to resist his infectious optimism. That memory was more than just a fleeting thought. It was a beacon in the storm. It reminded her that she had faced difficult moments before, times when the world felt too big and too cold, and she had made it through. Her father had always believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. And though he was gone now, his belief still lingered, a quiet strength that lived within her. The rain continued to fall, its rhythm steady and unyielding, but Emma's breathing began to even out. She wiped at her face, though it was impossible to tell where the rain ended and her tears began. For the first time that night, she didn't feel entirely alone. Her father's words echoed in her mind, carrying a message of hope that was as clear now as it had been then. Storms pass. They always do. Emma straightened, her resolve hardening like steel tempered in fire. The storm was still raging, and the path ahead was uncertain, but she wasn't going to give up. Not now, not when she still carried the strength her father had given her. He had taught her that there was beauty even in the hardest moments, that every storm carried with it the promise of a brighter sky. She tilted her head back, letting the rain wash over her face, and for a moment, she could almost hear Lucas's laughter, as if he were standing right behind her. The memory brought a small, bittersweet smile to her lips, a reminder that even in the darkest times, she wasn't truly alone. The forest around her didn't feel quite so menacing anymore. The trees still swayed violently in the wind, and the rain still poured without mercy, but Emma's steps felt lighter as she pressed on. Her father's belief in her had carried her this far, and she wasn't going to let him down. She would survive this night, find her way back, and prove to herself that she was as strong as he had always believed her to be. Somewhere in the distance, lightning flashed, illuminating the world for a split second. Emma took a deep breath, clutching the memory of her father close to her heart. Rainbows only come after the rain, she reminded herself, and with each step forward, she felt just a little closer to finding her own. The storm raged on, unrelenting and merciless, as Emma struggled to put one foot in front of the other. Every step felt like a battle against the elements, her drenched clothes weighing her down and her breath coming in short, panic bursts. The forest seemed endless, an expanse of blackness punctuated only by the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the chaos around her. The drumming of rain on leaves and the howling wind were a cacophony that swallowed her thoughts, leaving only fear and determination in their wake. But then, like a gift from the heavens, a flicker of light broke through the oppressive darkness. Emma froze, her heart pounding in her chest as she squinted through the rain. There it was again, a warm, golden glow dancing in the distance, barely visible through the sheets of water falling from the sky. It was a fire. A fire meant people, and people meant help. Her chest tightened with a desperate surge of hope, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to entertain until now. She started running, her soaked shoes squelching in the mud as she pushed herself forward. The thought of shelter, of warmth, of someone who could guide her back to safety was like fuel to her exhausted body. Her breath came in sharp gasps, her lungs burning from exertion, but she didn't care. All she could focus on was the promise of relief ahead, the flickering light that pierced the darkness like a beacon. As she drew closer, she could make out the outline of a small cabin nestled among the trees. The firelight shone through a window, casting flickering shadows that danced across the wet ground. Emma's heart raced as she stumbled toward it, the thought of finally escaping the storm filling her with her fragile optimism. She could picture herself inside, drying off by the fire, maybe even sipping a cup of something warm. The vision was enough to make her forget, for just a moment, the terror she had felt moments earlier. But just as she was about to reach the cabin, something stopped her dead in her tracks. A hand clamped over her mouth, firm and unyielding, silencing the scream that rose instinctively in her throat. Panic shot through her like electricity as her entire body tensed, her mind racing to comprehend what was happening. She tried to twist free, but the grip was too strong, holding her in place as if her struggle meant nothing. "Don't scream," a rough, low voice whispered in her ear, the words slicing through the rain like a blade. "There's no one to hear you anyway." The voice sent a chill down her spine, colder than the storm raging around her. She could feel the stranger's breath against her ear, his tone calm yet menacing, as if he had done this before. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her mind scrambling for a way out. But fear had rooted her to the spot. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. He was right. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, with the storm drowning out every sound, there really was no one to hear her scream. The stranger's hand stayed firmly over her mouth as he began to lead her toward the cabin. Emma's legs felt like they were moving of their own accord, her body betraying her fight-or-flight instincts as it submitted to his control. The rain continued to fall, soaking them both, but the storm outside paled in comparison to the storm raging inside her mind. Who was this man? Why had he grabbed her? What was he planning to do? The cabin, which had seemed so inviting just moments ago, now loomed ahead like a sinister trap. The flickering firelight that had given her hope now cast eerie shadows across the walls, the warm glow taking on a foreboding quality as she was led closer. The stranger pushed the door open with a creak and shoved her inside, his grip never loosening. The door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the sound of the storm and plunging the room into an oppressive silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Emma's eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the grim scene. The room was small and claustrophobic, filled with dust and cobwebs. The furniture was sparse and decrepit, a single, rusted table in the center, a few broken chairs, and shelves lined with what looked like jars of strange, unidentifiable objects. The fire burned in a cracked hearth, its embers glowing faintly, but the warmth it offered was overshadowed by the chill that settled over Emma as she realized just how isolated she was. The stranger finally released her, shoving her forward into the room. Emma stumbled, but managed to catch herself before falling. She turned to face him, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to steady her shaking hands. He stood in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the firelight. He was tall, his face obscured by the shadows, but his presence was unmistakably menacing. "Sit," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. Emma hesitated, every instinct in her screaming at her to run, to fight, to do anything but obey. But the fear of what he might do if she resisted kept her rooted to the spot. Slowly, reluctantly, she lowered herself onto one of the broken chairs, her eyes never leaving him. The stranger moved toward her, his footsteps slow and deliberate, as though savoring her fear. Emma's mind raced with questions, each one more horrifying than the last. Who was this man? Why had he brought her here? And most importantly, what did he want from her? The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing tighter with every passing second. Emma swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm despite the terror clawing at her insides. She knew she had to think, to plan, to find a way out of this nightmare. But as the stranger stood over her, his eyes cold and calculating, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was already trapped. The air inside the cabin was thick, damp with the scent of mildew and the lingering smoke from the fire. Emma sat frozen in the rickety chair, her gaze darting from the flames flickering in the hearth to the man pacing in front of her. He hadn't said much since dragging her into this strange place, but his silence spoke volumes. Every move he made, every deliberate step, sent waves of unease through her. She felt like a mouse trapped in a maze, while he was the cat deciding how long to toy with her before making his final move. Finally, he stopped pacing and turned toward her. The dim light of the fire illuminated his face for the first time, and she could see his features clearly now. He was older than she'd expected, his face weathered, his dark eyes intense and calculating. There was something about him that felt familiar, though Emma couldn't quite place it. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, a chilling silence fell. "Come with me," he said, his voice low but commanding. Emma didn't move at first. Her instinct screamed at her to resist, to fight, to do anything but follow him deeper into the unknown. But the look in his eyes left no room for argument. Slowly, she rose from the chair, her legs trembling beneath her. The man, who finally introduced himself as Victor, gestured toward the far wall. Emma hesitated, her gaze shifting to the door, but Victor's sharp glare warned her against even considering an escape. He led her to a section of the wall that looked no different from the rest of the decrepit cabin. The wood was warped and cracked, the surface covered in dust and cobwebs. But Victor moved with purpose, as though he knew exactly what he was doing. Without hesitation, he pressed his hand against the wall, and to Emma's astonishment, a hidden keypad slid out from behind a panel. Her heart raced as Victor placed his thumb on the pad, and with a quiet beep, a section of the wall slid open to reveal a dark staircase, descending into the earth. The air that wafted up was cold and stale, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and something metallic that Emma couldn't quite identify. Her stomach twisted into knots as she stared into the darkness below. "After you," Victor said, his tone eerily polite. Emma swallowed hard, her mouth dry as sandpaper. Her mind screamed at her to refuse, to fight, but the cold press of Victor's presence behind her left her with little choice. Taking a shaky breath, she stepped onto the staircase, the wooden steps creaking ominously under her weight. Victor followed close behind, his footsteps steady and unrelenting. The staircase seemed to go on forever, the walls narrowing with every step. By the time they reached the bottom, Emma felt as though she had descended into another world entirely. The basement was dimly lit by a single hanging bulb that swayed slightly, casting eerie shadows across the space. It was larger than she'd expected, with stone walls and a cold, hard floor that sent a chill through her already soaked shoes. And then she saw it. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes landed on the corkboard that dominated one side of the room. It was covered with photographs, dozens, maybe even hundreds of them. All of Emma. Her face stared back at her from every angle, every expression. Some of the photos were old, taken years ago when she was a child, while others were recent, so recent that she recognized the clothes she was wearing in them. Red strings connected the photographs, forming a chaotic web that seemed to have no clear beginning or end. Notes and scribbles were pinned alongside the pictures, words and symbols that made no sense to her, but filled her with an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as though someone had mapped out her entire life, every movement, every moment, in painstaking detail. Emma stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth as she tried to process what she was seeing. Questions flooded her mind, each one more horrifying than the last. How had Victor gotten these photos? Why had he been watching her? And for how long? "You're the key," Victor said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, almost clinical, as though he were discussing a science experiment rather than the terrifying display in front of them. Emma turned to face him, her voice trembling with fear and anger. "What is this? Why do you have these pictures of me? What do you want?" Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the corkboard, his fingers brushing over the photos as though they were sacred relics. "You don't understand yet," he said, his tone almost regretful. "But you will." Emma's fists clenched at her sides as a surge of defiance rose within her. "You're insane," she said. "Whatever you think I am, whatever you think I can do, you're wrong. I don't know you. I don't know any of this." Victor turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Your father knew," he said simply. The mention of her father was like a slap to the face. Emma felt the air leave her lungs as memories of Lucas flooded her mind, his warmth, his wisdom, his unwavering belief in her. And now this man, this stranger, was dragging her father into this nightmare? "You're lying," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Victor shook his head. "Lucas understood what you are, Emma. He knew you were different. Special. That's why he kept you hidden. That's why he never told you the truth." Emma's mind reeled. The truth? What truth? The room seemed to spin around her as she struggled to comprehend Victor's words. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her voice was lost in the storm of emotions swirling inside her. Victor stepped closer, his dark eyes boring into hers. "You're more important than you realize," he said. "And whether you like it or not, your fate is tied to something much bigger than yourself." Emma's knees felt weak, but she forced herself to stand her ground. She didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. She couldn't trust Victor. And whatever he wanted from her, she wasn't going to give it willingly. The dim, swaying light bulb cast unsettling shadows across the basement walls, making the room feel alive with unspoken tension. Emma's heart was pounding so loudly, she thought it might burst. Her mind was still reeling from the sight of the photographs covering the corkboard, each one of her, mapping her life in ways she couldn't even begin to comprehend. She didn't think it could get any stranger or more horrifying. But then her eyes landed on a single object lying on a dust-covered table. It was a photograph. Unlike the others, this one wasn't pinned to the board or strung up with red lines. It rested in an old wooden frame, its edges worn and splintered. Emma's breath hitched in her throat as she recognized the face in the picture. It was her father, Lucas. He was younger, his face full of the warmth and life she remembered so vividly, and he was standing next to someone, another man, taller and leaner, with a serious expression. They were arm in arm, smiling as though sharing some private joke. Emma's fingers trembled as she picked up the frame. Dust clung to the glass, and she wiped it away with her sleeve, revealing the image in sharper detail. Her father, Lucas, looked so happy. The other man, though unfamiliar, had an intensity about him, even in the photo. Before Emma could stop herself, she turned to Victor. "What is this?" she demanded, holding the photograph out toward him. Victor's expression shifted, his sharp, calculating demeanor softening just enough to show a hint of something deeper, regret, or maybe longing. He took a step closer, his hands clasped behind his back. For a moment, Emma thought he might not answer, but then he spoke, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. "That," he said, nodding toward the photo, "was taken years ago. Your father and I, we were partners. Best friends, in fact." Emma's stomach churned. The idea of this man, this stranger who had dragged her into this nightmare, being connected to her father, felt like a betrayal of the memories she held dear. She shook her head, clutching the photograph closer to her chest. "You're lying," she said, her voice wavering with a mix of anger and disbelief. "My father would have told me. He would have mentioned you." Victor's lips pressed into a thin line. "Lucas didn't tell you because he wanted to protect you," he said. "He thought the less you knew, the safer you'd be. But that doesn't change the truth. He and I worked together for years on projects that would have changed the world." Emma took a step back, her mind racing. Projects? What kind of projects? Her father had been a scientist, she knew that much, but he'd never spoken about his work in detail. He'd always kept it separate from their lives, a boundary she'd never thought to question, until now. "What does any of this have to do with me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why do you have these pictures of me? Why are you dragging me into this?" Victor's eyes darkened, his expression hardening once more. "Because you're the key, Emma," he said. "Your father and I were working on something extraordinary, something that could reshape the future of humanity. But we hit a wall. We needed something more, something unique. And then your father discovered you." Emma felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. "Discovered me?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you talking about?" Victor sighed, his gaze dropping to the floor as though the weight of his words was too much to bear. "You're special, Emma," he said. "Your DNA. It's unlike anything we've ever seen. Lucas knew it, even if he didn't fully understand it at first. That's why he kept you hidden, why he never let you out of his sight. He was trying to protect you, but he was also trying to protect his work." Emma's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "So what?" she snapped. You think you can just kidnap me, drag me down here, and use me like some kind of lab experiment? Victor's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Emma thought he might lash out. But instead, he took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging as though under the weight of some invisible burden. It's not like that, he said. This isn't about hurting you. It's about saving lives. Your DNA. It could unlock answers we've been searching for decades. It could cure diseases, extend lifespans, even prevent death itself. Don't you see? You're the key to something bigger than any of us. Emma shook her head, her mind racing. She didn't know what to believe. Her father had always been a beacon of trust and safety in her life, and now this man was telling her that he'd been keeping secrets from her. Secrets that could change everything she thought she knew about herself. It was too much to process. "And what happens to me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What do I have to sacrifice for your so-called answers?" Victor hesitated, and in that hesitation, Emma saw the truth. Whatever he needed from her, it wouldn't come without a cost. She felt a surge of anger and fear rise within her, mingling with the confusion and betrayal that already clouded her mind. "I'm not going to be your experiment," she said firmly, stepping back. "I don't care what you think you can do with my DNA. I'm not giving it to you." Victor's face hardened, and for a moment, Emma thought he might try to force her. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're more like your father than I realized," he said quietly. He was just as stubborn. Emma's grip on the photograph tightened. Whatever the truth was, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't trust Victor. And if her father had believed in protecting her, then she would honor that belief. Emma stood frozen, her mind unable to process the words Victor had just uttered. Immortal. The word echoed in her head, bouncing around like a hollow drum. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Her breath hitched, and she took an instinctive step back, pressing herself against the cold, crumbling wall of the basement as if it could offer her some kind of protection. Victor, however, seemed unaffected by her reaction. His eyes, dark and intense, locked onto hers as he spoke with a strange mixture of clinical detachment and a barely concealed urgency. "You survived that accident, Emma. It was no miracle. It was the beginning of something bigger, something you were meant to be a part of." Emma's mind reeled back to that day, the day that had changed everything. The memory was still vivid, haunting her like a ghost. She remembered the screeching tires, the metal crunching and twisting as the car rolled over the cliffside. She could still feel the terror, the blinding pain as her world flipped upside down. The doctors had been certain there was no way she would make it out alive. They had said the crash was too severe, that no one could have survived. Yet, she had woken up, her body healing at an unnatural rate, as if time itself had reversed the damage. The doctors had been baffled, calling it a miracle. But hearing it now from Victor, it felt like a betrayal. "How?" she croaked, her voice barely audible. "How could you possibly know about that?" Victor stepped forward, his expression softening, though there was no warmth in his eyes. "I was there. I was the one who monitored your recovery. Your father and I, we were working on a project. We believed that there was a possibility of human beings transcending the limits of life, that we could extend our time on Earth. We thought you could be the answer." Emma's heart hammered in her chest. Her father, Lucas, had always been a man of science, of reason. She had trusted him with everything, and the idea that he had been part of something so far beyond what she had ever imagined felt like an earthquake beneath her feet. "No," she said, shaking her head as if doing so could rid her of the impossible reality Victor was trying to force upon her. "No, this isn't real. I'm not immortal. You're just trying to manipulate me, to make me believe something that isn't true." Victor didn't respond immediately, his gaze steady, unwavering. Then, slowly, he walked to a nearby table and picked up a folder, its edges frayed, as if it had been handled countless times. He opened it carefully, revealing documents and images of Emma, medical reports, scans, notes from various specialists who had all been baffled by her miraculous recovery. "These are your records," he said, his voice taking on a more informative tone, as though speaking to a colleague. "When the accident happened, the medical world thought they were witnessing a miracle. You were one of the few people to survive a crash like that, but what followed was even more extraordinary. The rate at which your body healed, within days you were walking. Within weeks you were back to normal. It wasn't just recovery, it was regeneration. Your cells, they were regenerating at a speed no human has ever experienced." Emma looked at the papers, each one seeming to confirm what Victor was saying. The tests, the results, they all pointed to something that could only be described as impossible. But even as the evidence weighed heavily in her mind, there was a part of her that refused to accept it. She remembered everything about that time, the pain, the confusion, but she also remembered the strength, the certainty that she would survive, that somehow her life had been spared for a reason. "You said you wanted to use my DNA," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you mean? What are you going to do to me?" Victor turned back to her, his face serious now, almost solemn. "I need to study it, Emma, to understand how your body can heal the way it does. If we can isolate the mechanism, the process that allows you to regenerate, we can use it to alter human biology forever. You could be the key to unlocking immortality for everyone. It could change medicine, change the world. But first I need a sample of your DNA." Emma recoiled at the thought. The idea of someone extracting her genetic material, of taking a part of her for their experiments. It felt invasive, grotesque. "No, I won't let you do that. You can't just take what you want from me. You can't just—" "Emma," Victor interrupted, his voice low but insistent. "It's not just about you. It's about saving lives. This is bigger than us. Think about it. The potential is limitless. You could save thousands, maybe millions of people. You could stop disease, eliminate aging, and eradicate death itself. This is your father's legacy. And now it's yours too?" His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Emma felt the weight of his argument pressing down on her. She thought of her father, of the man who had always told her to think critically, to consider the bigger picture. But this was something she couldn't fathom. She couldn't comprehend the consequences of playing with life and death, of tampering with nature on such a scale. She had no desire to be anyone's experiment, no matter how grand the promises sounded. "You don't understand," she said, the words escaping in a rush of emotion. "You can't just change everything because you think it's right. What if something goes wrong? What if you destroy everything, destroy me? I'm not your lab rat." Victor's face hardened, and for a moment Emma saw something dark, something dangerous, lurking in his eyes. "I'm not giving you a choice, Emma," he said quietly, almost too calmly. "If you won't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to take what I need by force. You have no idea how much this could mean, how much it could change the world. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Emma's pulse quickened, her breath shallow. She had never been so afraid, so utterly powerless. She was being pushed into a corner, and she didn't know how to escape. She had no idea how she could fight against someone so determined, so willing to sacrifice everything for his vision of the future. But one thing was clear in her mind. She wasn't going to let him take her, not without a fight. Whatever Victor wanted from her, he would have to fight for it. And Emma wasn't going down without a battle. Emma's heart raced, her body still trembling from the weight of Victor's words. She felt trapped in an impossible situation, where every move she made seemed to lead her deeper into a nightmare. Victor's presence loomed over her, his intentions as cold and calculating as ever. She could feel the pressure mounting, the oppressive atmosphere of the basement closing in around her. Her mind raced, but it was a blur of confusion and fear. How could she possibly escape this? How could she fight against someone who had manipulated her, someone who knew so much about her father, about everything? The silence that hung between them seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the faint crackling of the dim light overhead. Emma felt a sudden chill ripple through the room, as though the air had shifted. The temperature dropped, and her breath came out in sharp, uneven gasps. Her thoughts scrambled in the chaos. But just as she was about to open her mouth to speak, something extraordinary happened. A soft, familiar presence washed over her like a wave, comforting and warm, yet filled with a deep sense of urgency. For a fleeting moment, she could have sworn she heard a whisper, one she had longed to hear for so many years. "Emma?" Her heart skipped a beat. The voice was unmistakable. It was the voice of her father, Lucas. But how? She felt her breath catch in her throat, her body going still as she turned around, searching for the source of the voice. "Emma, listen to me," the voice continued, clearer now, more real than anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't just in her head. It was coming from the very air around her, filling the space in the basement with an undeniable presence. "Father," she gasped, her voice trembling with disbelief. She reached out instinctively, as if she could touch him, pull him back from whatever realm he was in. "Is it really you?" There, in the dim light of the basement, she saw him, her father. His form materialized in front of her, almost ethereal, like a mist that was taking shape. The outline of his figure shimmered in the air, but the presence of him, the strength of his spirit, was undeniable. He stood before her, just as she remembered him, his warm eyes filled with concern, his smile the same reassuring one she had always known. "Emma, I don't have much time," Lucas's voice said, and Emma felt a deep pang of sadness in her chest, knowing that this brief moment was all she would have. "You have to listen to me. Victor, he doesn't care about you. His intentions are selfish, and his research, it's not about saving anyone. It's about exploiting you, using your immortality for his own gain." Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her body shaking with a mixture of emotions. Part of her wanted to collapse in her father's arms, to let him take her away from all of this, to escape the terror that had been closing in around her. But another part of her, the part that had always been strong, always been determined, refused to believe this was the end. "Father," she whispered, her voice cracking, "I don't know what to do. I'm so scared. I don't know how to fight him. I don't know how to get out of here." Lucas's image flickered slightly, and for a moment, Emma feared he might disappear completely. But then his presence solidified again, and he took a step closer to her. His hand reached out, though it was transparent, and it hovered just above her own. It felt as though a warmth was radiating from him, soothing the fear that had overtaken her. "You've always had the strength to fight, Emma," he said softly, his voice filled with both love and urgency. "You've carried that strength inside you all your life. Don't doubt it now. You are capable of so much more than you know. You don't need to rely on anyone else to save you. You can save yourself." Tears sprang to Emma's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She couldn't afford to break down now. Her father's spirit, his words, were the only thing keeping her grounded in this overwhelming moment. She clutched at the fabric of her shirt, as though holding on to him in some way, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions flooding her. "But how?" she whispered, feeling the weight of the question. "How can I fight him? I'm just one person, and he's so powerful. He knows everything about me. He's been watching me. How am I supposed to stop him?" Her father's form seemed to shimmer in the dim light, his eyes locking onto hers with such intensity that Emma felt it in the core of her being. "It's not about power, Emma. It's about trusting yourself. Trust your instincts. You already have everything you need inside you. Your immortality isn't just a gift, it's a weapon. And you know how to use it. Don't let fear stop you." His words sank deep into Emma's soul, like a seed taking root. Her mind, once clouded with doubt and confusion, began to clear. She could feel her body, her very being, awakening to a new sense of purpose, of clarity. She had the strength to stand up for herself. She had always had it, even when she was just a child. Her father had always believed in her, and now She would believe in herself. "I trust you, Dad," she whispered, her voice firm, a quiet but powerful resolve settling into her chest. "I'm going to fight." Lucas's form seemed to glow brighter for a moment, as though he were smiling at her, proud. "I believe in you, Emma. I'm always with you, no matter what happens. You are stronger than you think. Now go. You have to stop him before it's too late." With those final words, his figure began to fade, slowly dissipating into the air as if the very fabric of reality was pulling him away. Emma reached out, desperate to hold on to him, but she knew it was pointless. He was gone, and she was alone again. But this time it didn't matter. His spirit had given her what she needed, the strength to move forward. Emma stood tall, feeling the fire of determination burning within her. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't just a victim in this twisted game. She was capable, she was strong, and she was going to make sure that Victor would never have the power he thought he had over her. With her father's words echoing in her mind, she was ready to fight back. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she stood there in the dim light of the basement, her father's photograph gripped tightly in her hand. The weight of everything, of the situation, of the man standing before her, of her own internal conflict, crushed her. But there was something inside her now, something that burned with a fierce resolve. Her father's spirit had given her the strength she needed, the belief that she wasn't alone. She wasn't the frightened girl who had wandered into the woods that night, lost and vulnerable. She was something more, something powerful. The power had always been within her, and now she could feel it, rising up inside her, ready to break free. Victor stood across from her, his eyes narrow, calculating. He had thought that by manipulating her, by using her as a tool for his twisted research, he could bend her to his will. But what he didn't understand was that Emma wasn't just his experiment. She was someone far stronger than he could ever comprehend. She was her father's daughter, and that meant something far greater than any of his schemes. Holding the photograph of her father before her, Emma felt a wave of emotion flood through her. It was as though the picture was alive, the memories of her father rushing back with a clarity she had never experienced before. She could hear his voice in her mind once again, urging her to trust herself, to believe in the strength he had always seen in her. Her father had taught her how to face the darkest moments of life, and how to keep going even when everything seemed impossible. This was no different. She had to escape for herself and for the world. Victor's expression shifted slightly as he watched her, his eyes narrowing, but Emma could see the flicker of uncertainty in them. He had underestimated her, just like everyone else. She wasn't just a victim. She was a force to be reckoned with. "Victor," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. "You've made a huge mistake. You think you can control me, use me, but you're wrong." She stepped forward, her legs steady, her hand still holding the photograph of her father. "You don't understand who I am. You don't understand the strength inside me. And now, I'm going to make sure you never hurt anyone again." For a moment Victor said nothing. His expression twisted, as though he was considering her words, weighing them. But Emma could see the crack in his composure, the doubt in his eyes. She could feel the power of her father's spirit inside her, pushing her to confront him, to face her fears head-on. "You think you can intimidate me with your threats," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But I'm not afraid of you, Victor. I know what you're trying to do, and I'm not going to let you succeed." Victor's hand twitched toward the keypad on the wall, but Emma was faster. She lifted her father's photograph higher, holding it up in front of him, using it as a shield against his intentions. Her heart beat loudly in her chest, but she stood firm, unyielding. "You'll open that door now," she said, her voice cold and commanding. Victor's lips curled into a sneer, but there was something else in his eyes now. A flicker of fear, perhaps. He had underestimated her resolve, and in that moment, he realized he had lost control. He stepped toward the wall, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for the keypad. Emma's eyes never left him as he entered the code, her fingers tightening around the photograph of her father. She had made it this far. She wasn't going to let fear stop her now. The sound of the door unlocking sent a rush of adrenaline through Emma. She didn't wait for Victor's next move. She didn't care to see the expression on his face as she turned and sprinted toward the open door. She didn't care about anything except for getting out of that cabin, away from Victor's clutches, and into the storm where she could finally breathe again. As she stepped out into the torrential rain, the world seemed to come alive around her. The storm, fierce and unforgiving, slapped her face with cold, relentless drops, but she didn't mind. The rain felt cleansing, like it was washing away the weight of everything she had endured. The wind howled around her, but Emma kept moving, her feet pounding against the wet ground, her body propelled by the will to survive. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get far away from that cabin, far away from Victor and whatever twisted plans he had for her. She could feel the pulse of her immortality inside her, the power of her survival, and it gave her the strength to keep running, even when her legs ached, even when her lungs burned with the effort. She could feel the memory of her father's spirit urging her forward, a silent whisper in the storm that reminded her she was never truly alone. As the storm raged on, Emma pushed herself harder, the sense of freedom growing with every step. She was no longer a victim, no longer someone who would allow herself to be controlled. She was Emma, and she was going to expose Victor's plans, no matter what it took. Eventually, Emma stumbled upon a road, her clothes drenched and her body trembling from exhaustion. But she didn't stop. She knew the worst was behind her. She would get help. She would make sure the authorities knew everything about Victor's research and his attempts to use her. As she stood there, the rain pouring down around her, Emma finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. She had made it. She had escaped. She was immortal, stronger than ever, and nothing could stop her now. The next day headline was, "Lost Girl in the Woods Barely Escapes Attempted Murder."